What if I told you that for 4 easy payments of $19.95, you could experience this magical foot washing that will fix all your worldly problems? Do you remember infomercials from back in the day that sounded just like that? No matter what the product happened to be, if you watched one of those infomercials for more than 5 minutes, you almost always ended up thinking that the air fryer or the set of knives or the cooking pan was not only worth buying, but that owning it would somehow solve all of your deepest struggles in life. I confess, I watched a lot of infomercials on Saturday morning when I was a kid. I kind of loved it. And even as a 10-year-old, I would always find myself pulled into this sense that the product on TV was the one thing standing between me and true happiness. I'm so grateful that I didn't have a credit card when I was 10 years old, because otherwise I'm sure I'd still own and still be paying for all of the Snuggies and ShamWows and George Foreman grills. Infomercials have this way of convincing us that there really is a quick fix to the problems in our life. On this day, as we hear about Jesus' actions around the table during the Last Supper, I wonder if the disciples, and Peter in particular, I wonder if he was living with this type of quick fix mentality. Let me explain. Peter and the other disciples there that night were, as you likely know, Jewish. And so they had been taught since they were young about the Messiah, and how the Messiah would be this great military leader who would lead God's people to the promised land and set everything right in the world. And now remember, at this point in time, Peter and the disciples had been following Jesus around for 3 years, witnessing his miracles, hearing his teachings. And so they all must have been thinking that Jesus was the Messiah, the one that they had been told about since they were children. And that is why he had come to Jerusalem, to restore Israel. Because that's what the Messiah was supposed to do. The Messiah would enter Jerusalem, just as Jesus had done on that Sunday before. He would enter the holy capital city, and he would overthrow the Roman government, and he would reestablish Israel as this great and mighty nation. When we read this gospel passage tonight, we have to realize that this was Peter's mindset sitting around the table at that moment. The Messiah had come to the holy city, and soon everything would be right in the world. When you understand that these were likely the thoughts racing through Peter's head, you start to have a little more compassion for the way he conducted himself at dinner that night. As we heard in the gospel passage, Peter is at first completely opposed to the idea of Jesus washing his feet. And that makes good sense. Foot washing in those days was a job for a servant or a slave. When you would arrive at a dinner, the host might ask their servant to wash the feet of the table guests who had just arrived. But certainly the host himself would not be the one to wash the feet. And so Peter must have been thinking that he should not allow Jesus to play this role. Jesus is the host of the meal. He's not a servant or a slave. Not only that, but Jesus is the Messiah, the one who's come to Jerusalem to overthrow Rome and make Israel powerful again. What business does Jesus have washing feet? But when Peter refuses, Jesus said, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." And that gets Peter's attention. He doesn't want to miss out on whatever the Messiah might be up to in Jerusalem. Peter's probably already picturing himself as the new advisor to the new Messiah king of Israel. And so if that means he has to have his feet washed, well, then I guess that's all right. Because you see, Peter, throughout this whole reading, is so focused on his idea of the Messiah. And he, just like any other Jew at that time, thought that having Israel restored to power would be the panacea. It would be the cure-all. If Jesus really were to restore Israel, well, then that meant that everything would be right in the world. Do you notice how this type of thinking sounds so much like my mindset when I watched infomercials at 10 years old? If I just get a Bowflex, then my life will be complete. Since the beginning of time, humans have chased after objects and ideas, thinking that all their problems could be solved by some sort of quick fix. We can be so caught up in thinking that happiness and joy will find us once we've gotten the promotion, or once we've gone on the vacation, or once we've bought the sports car, or once we are finally able to retire. Irish philosopher Peter Rollins calls all of these things sacred objects. They're these holy ideas that we spend our life chasing after, thinking that if we get them, then our life will be complete. When I read the gospel passage, it really seems to me that the disciple Peter has shifted into this type of magical thinking. Peter moves from totally opposed to totally on board with the foot washing because he thinks that somehow this moment will play an important part in conquering Rome and establishing the Messiah and reestablishing Israel as a powerful nation. And then they can live happily ever after. But life doesn't work like that. Even though commercials and infomercials and politicians and celebrities and friends and family, even though we have a constant stream of people in our life telling us that this or that is all that stands between us and true contentment, that's not how it works. And Jesus knew this. The message of Jesus is so much different than an infomercial. He didn't come to overthrow Rome or to give us a quick fix for all of life's problems. Jesus came to give us a change in perspective, a new way of living, not a quick fix, but a new fixation. Peter and the other Jews of that time were fixated on reestablishing Israel. This was their sacred object, to see Israel restored to power. When Peter finally decides, in this fixated state, to allow Jesus to wash his feet, he says to Jesus, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." He says this because washing someone's hands and head, well, that's the role that a rabbi might play. Peter's reluctantly on board with Jesus washing him, but he can't stand the thought of Jesus playing the role of a servant because that doesn't compute with his sacred object that Peter's chasing after. How could a servant overthrow Rome? Peter wants Jesus to stand up and wash him completely, to play the role of a rabbi and a Messiah once again, because that's the type of person who will overthrow Rome. Peter's behavior and Jesus' reaction to it should be instructive for all of us. If we remain fixated on gaining enough power or earning enough money or achieving enough accolades, it will always leave us feeling empty in the end. There's no sacred object out there that if we get it, will make our life complete. But there is a sacred path. After washing the disciples' feet, Jesus tells Peter and the rest of the disciples that they should wash one another's feet. And then he gives them a new commandment, to love one another. Service and love. This should be our focus. This is where abundant life is found. It's not a quick fix. It'd make a terrible infomercial. But this new fixation, this new way of life that Jesus calls us into, it's the way we were created to live. Jesus didn't come to Jerusalem to overthrow Rome. He came to give his life. Because Jesus knew that a life of service and love is so much more fulfilling than chasing after sacred objects. Amen. We join now in singing our hymn of the day, Eternal Lord of Love, Behold Your Church. It's on page 4 in your bulletin. I invite you to stand.